Under a blood-red dawn, 10 armed riders crested the ridge, led by Silas Kane, a man who burned villages to ashes for a secret that only Lena Redbird carried in her memory. Inside that battered cabin, Caleb Hawthorne, once the deadliest bounty hunter alive, stood bleeding but unbowed, rifle steady in his grip. As gunfire ripped the valley apart, two broken souls made a choice that would shock Raven Hollow forever. "You think you can take what's mine?" Caleb growled, voice rough as gravel. Lena's whisper rose through the storm. "No more running. When a girl stops running and a man remembers how to live again, bullets mean nothing, because some storms can't bury the truth forever." This is the night the hunted turned to fight, and the ghost of a man found a reason to stand. They used to call him the ghost of Raven Hollow, Caleb Hawthorne, the bounty hunter who never missed his mark. Back then, the wanted posters outnumbered the crosses in the graveyard, and more than a few of those graves were filled by the same hand that now gripped a battered rifle behind cabin walls. Caleb hadn't always been a shadow on the edge of town. There was a time when the sound of laughter echoed through these hills. The light voice of his young son, Sam, riding the old fence rails like they were Mustangs, while Martha, his wife, stood by the cabin door with bread in the oven and a promise in her eyes that the world could still be good. But the frontier has a way of stealing what you love most. A single winter fever took Sam. Martha followed the boy into the ground before the spring thawed the valley. And Caleb, with all his skills at tracking men and collecting gold for their heads, couldn't stop the one thing that mattered. He buried them beneath the same cottonwood where he'd carved their names when they married. Some nights he still sat by that tree, asking the wind if ghosts ever forgive the living. Before Martha and Sam, Caleb's reputation was carved in blood. Men whispered that he'd once dragged an entire gang out of the Blackthorn Pass single-handed. Bodies lashed to pack mules, the silver reward clinking in his saddlebag. He told himself he did it for them, to build something safe, a fence the world couldn't breach. But when you trade souls for silver, the debt comes due in your dreams. Miles away, Lena Redbird's nightmare began in fire. Her village, a scattering of tents hidden between Red Canyon walls, woke one dawn to the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifle shots. Silas Kane, wearing the blue coat of a colonel he hadn't earned in years, rode at the front. He wanted stories passed down through Lena's family. Stories of a canyon that bled gold when the river split the stone just right. When the elders refused, Kane's men torched the lodges and slaughtered the horses. By dusk, the canyon was nothing but ash, and the memory of songs sung by women long buried. Lena ran with a bullet burning a hole through her side, and the taste of her grandmother's last words on her tongue. "When they chase you, hide where the wolves won't go." For days she stumbled through pine and snow, believing no soul would shelter her, no hand would lift her up. Too many times trust had led her people to chains or graves. She believed this land only had room for the ones strong enough to stand alone. But then she found the barn, and the ghost who lived inside it. And on that night, as wind battered the cabin walls, two stories, one of a man who'd lost everything, and one of a girl who never had a chance to begin, collided in the snowdrift shadows, setting the valley on a path that even 10 riders at dawn could never bury. Caleb Hawthorne didn't know how to talk to ghosts. He knew how to hunt men, how to patch a bullet wound with whiskey and a steady hand, how to sit so still under the pines that even the deer mistook him for stone. But words, kind ones at least, had left him the day they lowered his boy into the frost-hardened earth. So when the girl on his bed first opened her eyes, he had nothing to offer but soup. He ladled broth into a chipped tin bowl, careful not to let the steam scald his hands. He set it on the table beside her without a word. Lena Redbird, though she had not yet given him that name, watched him like a cornered animal, dark eyes flicking from the spoon to the rifle leaning against the wall. She didn't touch the bowl. She didn't need to. The smell of it, bone, marrow, salt, seeped into her dreams that night, a promise that maybe the world had one more day to give her. Caleb moved around her like he would a trap he'd laid in the woods, cautious, deliberate, never too close. Each morning he left something behind, a fresh cloth for her wound, a tin cup of boiled water, once a comb. It was old, carved wood, small flowers worn nearly flat from years of use. Martha's comb. Caleb had found it in a drawer that still smelled faintly of wild mint and lye soap. He placed it at the foot of Lena's bed, half expecting her to snap it in two and toss it into the hearth. But when he came back that night, he found her asleep with it, still clutched in her hand, her matted hair half tamed. It was the first crack in the wall between them. Some nights, when the wind moaned through the boards and the pine branches scraped the roof like old bones, Caleb sat by the hearth, the fire painting his scars in shifting orange light. He would catch her watching him, not in fear, not anymore, but with a searching look, as if she was trying to read the story of his life in the lines on his face. He never asked for hers. Not yet. It was Lena who spoke first. One evening, after a supper of boiled beans and silence, she reached for a stick of charred wood and began to draw in the ashes beside the hearth. 4 stars, then a 5th. Her finger moved in practiced arcs, connecting them with delicate lines. Caleb frowned, leaning closer. "This one," she said softly, her voice raw from disuse, "is the hunter. He waits for the elk, where the river splits the canyon." Caleb looked from the embers to the window where the night sky glittered clear and sharp. He squinted. "Orion," he said, half to himself. She tilted her head. "You have your names. We have ours. Same sky, different stories." She showed him more. The buffalo's back, the singing woman, the line of stars that pointed always home. Stories her grandmother had whispered by firelight in a canyon now buried in soot and bone. Caleb listened like a boy again, the way he once had when Martha read to Sam from the battered Bible she kept on the mantel. But these stories were older than any Bible, older than his guilt. In the days that followed, the silence between them began to feel less like a wall and more like a blanket they could both share. Lena's strength returned in slow measures. She helped sweep the porch, her steps careful but determined. She rinsed tin plates in the creek, though the icy water bit deep into her still healing side. She did not speak much, but when she did, her words hung in the air like smoke, fragile but impossible to ignore. Caleb, for his part, watched the tree line like a hawk. He rebuilt the trap lines he'd once abandoned, not for pelts now, but for signs. A boot print, a snapped twig. He'd known too many men who would burn a cabin just to smoke out whatever was hiding inside. At night, he strung wire bells across the fence posts and checked the rifle by the door 3 times before he let himself doze in the rocking chair, boots still on. In the stillness, he remembered stories of men like him. Bounty hunters who had traded pistols for plows, blood for shelter. He'd heard of a man they called Old Weaver up in the Iron Hills, who'd once dragged outlaws to the noose but spent his last years building bunkhouses for drifters and lost souls. Some said he did it to buy back the pieces of himself he'd sold for reward money. Caleb didn't know if redemption worked that way, but when he looked at Lena sleeping under Martha's patched quilt, he thought maybe some regrets needed a place to rest before they could move on. One night, as the fire dwindled to embers, Lena pointed out a cluster of stars through the frost-rimmed window. "You see that one?" she murmured. "That's the winter hawk. My people say he watches over the ones who stand alone." Caleb followed her gaze, but all he saw was a cold, endless sky. "You're not alone now," he said, the words tasting strange on his tongue, like a prayer he hadn't spoken in years. She looked at him, eyes dark and bright at once. For the first time, she believed him. Outside, the traps waited for footsteps that never came. Inside, 2 people who'd nearly forgotten how to live were learning, by inches, what it meant to stand together. Wordless but awake, waiting for whatever dawn might bring through the pines. Winter loosened its grip on Raven Hollow, but for Caleb Hawthorne, the air grew sharper every time he stepped off the porch. He could feel Silas Kane moving in the shadows, a cold presence that seeped under the cabin's walls at night. Some mornings he'd find boot prints by the creek or a half-buried stub of a campfire where none should be. Each sign made his hands clench tighter around the rifle he'd sworn he'd bury with him when the time came. It wasn't just his life anymore. Lena Redbird moved through the house now like a half-tamed flame, still wary of the wind at the door, but stronger each dawn. She swept the floors, kept the fire alive, fed the horses with a gentleness that reminded Caleb of the boy he'd lost. And when she slept, she dreamed of flames and the blue coat of a man who would burn the world to find her again. Word spread faster than wolves in these hills. Folks Caleb hadn't seen in years began to drift back through the pines. Some came by the post station 2 ridges south, whispering that Silas Kane had men with him. Men too cheap to keep their spurs quiet. Men with fingers always itching for the trigger. They said Kane had a piece of paper stamped by a judge in a distant town, a paper that called Lena a fugitive and made hunting her down the law. Caleb spat in the snow when he heard it. He'd seen enough ink and lies nailed to church doors to know how the law bent for the men who paid enough. But a curious thing happens out here, on land too wild for courtrooms. People remember. The old stories of what a man once did stick like burrs to a wool coat. 10 winters back, Caleb had tracked a group of cattle rustlers clear to the canyon's edge for the Odell family, bringing back not just the stolen herd, but a young boy they'd taken hostage. Another spring, when the floodwaters rose and buried half the flats in mud, it was Caleb who rode out alone, pulling 2 children from a drowned barn roof and giving them the last blankets in his cabin. Now, as word spread that Cain's men were coming, those old debts rose like ghosts around Caleb's land. One by one, wagons rolled in at dusk. Jude Mercer, his leg half lame from a mine collapse, unloaded fence posts and a box of rusty nails. The Sawyer brothers brought flour, salt, and 3 old squirrel rifles that hadn't fired straight since their father's time. But they brought them anyway. Miriam Odell, thin as a fence rail, handed Caleb a small tin box. Inside were 6 shells, polished bright. "Figured you'd put these to better use than we ever could," she said, voice rough but eyes steady. Lena watched all this from the porch, arms wrapped tight across her chest. She'd never seen white settlers stand between a Comanche woman and the men who called themselves the law. She didn't quite trust it yet, but when a small boy, Miriam's youngest, shyly offered her an apple from his pocket, Lena felt the first crack of warmth behind her ribs that had nothing to do with fire. That night, the wind howled like a chorus of wolves. Inside, Caleb spread out a battered map on the kitchen table. He marked out every angle of the fence line, every weak spot where Cain's men might slip through. Beside him, Lena sat cross-legged on the floor, a rifle resting across her knees. The firelight caught the braids in her hair, the beads she'd tied there as quiet wards against bad spirits. "You ever shoot?" Caleb asked her, voice low. Lena shook her head. Her people had taught her a bow, a knife, weapons that made no noise when the enemy slept. But this was different. This was standing your ground when you knew death would come in daylight, loud and merciless. "Then we start now," he said, and so they did. Each dawn, before the frost burned off the pasture, Caleb showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to squeeze instead of pull, how to breathe so the world narrowed to sight and heartbeat and the slow pull of the trigger. Her fingers, still half-healed, bled against the cold wood, but she never flinched. When the rifle grew too heavy, she took up her bow again, drawing arrows in a fluid motion that made Caleb think of the stories she told him by the fire, of hawks and winter constellations. He taught her to read the land too, where a rabbit would burrow under the thorn, where a man might crouch for cover. They moved through the brush like ghosts themselves, 2 shadows bound by a promise neither had spoken out loud. We stand together, or we fall alone. One evening, they sat on the steps while the settlers hammered boards over the barn door and strung wire bells between the fence posts. Lena watched the men sweat and curse and spit tobacco into the snow. She turned to Caleb, eyes dark as a new moon. "Why do they help?" she asked. "Why not turn me in? It would be easier." Caleb's jaw flexed. He reached for the old cross he'd nailed above the door. Martha's cross, now weathered and cracked. "Because out here," he said, voice rough as the wind, "when the law comes wearing a lie, all you've got is each other." A truth older than any badge, older than any bounty. And as the storm gathered its strength in the dark line of trees beyond the ridge, Lena Redbird rested her palm on the stock of the rifle and made her own quiet vow. No more running. Dawn rose pale and sharp over Raven Hollow, cold enough to crack fence rails. Caleb Hawthorne had been awake for hours, crouched in the barn's upper loft, one eye pressed to a rifle scope that had seen more dead men than Sunday prayers. Below him, the valley slept, or pretended to. But Caleb knew better. He'd felt the storm coming for days, the hush in the trees, the crows fleeing west. When he saw the first silhouettes crest the ridge, his breath came out like smoke through his teeth. 10 riders. Silas Kane at the front, his cavalry coat flaring behind him like a flag no nation would claim. Beside him, mercenaries in mismatched grays, rifles across their saddles, eyes scanning the cabin's battered roofline for any sign of life. Inside, Lena Redbird tied her hair back, fingers deft even though they trembled. Her bow rested by the window. A rifle, heavier than her arms would like, leaned against the hearth. She could hear the settlers outside, Jude Mercer barking orders, the Sawyer brothers checking the traps, Miriam Odell pressing a kiss to her son's brow before she sent him crawling under the cabin floorboards just in case. But one child hadn't wanted to hide alone. Little Samuel Odell, no more than 7, clutched Lena's skirt with both fists. "I'm not scared," he whispered, though his eyes shone wet. She knelt to meet him. "Brave boy," she said, voice soft as river reeds. "Stay close. When the wind rises, you keep your head down. Understand?" He nodded, burying his face in the hem of her shawl. When Lena stood again, something fierce settled behind her ribs, fiercer than fear had ever been. Outside, Kane's voice cracked the morning. "Hawthorne, send the girl out. She's government property, and you're a dead man if you stand in the way." Caleb watched from the loft, one finger on the trigger. Property. He'd hunted men for coins, but never once had he spoken of a soul that way. He spotted Kane's gloved hand flick a signal to the men flanking left. They'd circle the barn. Caleb steadied his breath, squeezed the trigger. The first shot cracked the dawn, knocking a mercenary's rifle clean from his grasp. Shouts erupted like fire through dry grass. Gunfire rattled the fence line. The settlers returned fire from hay bales and hastily built barricades. Jude Mercer took a round in the shoulder but held the line, cursing like a preacher on Judgment Day. Miriam Odell, thin hands steady, passed him a new box of shells with a glare that could kill a man twice. Inside the cabin, Lena pulled Samuel under the old oak table. She pushed the rifle into his trembling hands. "If I say run, you run. Don't look back." The boy swallowed, nodding. A shadow fell across the window. Lena rolled to the side just as glass shattered. A mercenary lunged through the frame, boots crunching the broken pane. Lena grabbed her bow, drew an arrow smooth and fast. The first shaft buried in his thigh, sending him stumbling back. She notched another, but a bullet tore through the door, splintering it in half. Caleb saw the breach from the loft. He dropped from the hayloft ladder like a stone, hitting the ground hard, ribs flaring with pain. He ducked behind a trough as Kane's men fired into the barn. Wood splintered. Horses screamed. Caleb rolled, shoulder braced against the stall door, lining up shot after shot. He felt a burn slice across his arm, a grazing hit, but stayed steady. One more breath, one more bullet. In the cabin, Lena heard the child's sobs under the table, the boots stomping closer. She had one arrow left. She waited. The man kicked the table aside, reaching for the boy. Lena leapt forward, tackling him to the ground, the arrowhead bearing deep in his side. He roared, striking her across the face. Her vision blurred. She grabbed for the fallen rifle, hands slipping on blood and sweat. The mercenary lunged, and suddenly the small, terrified shape of Samuel slammed a cast-iron pot onto the man's head. Once, twice. Lena pulled the boy back, pressed her forehead to his. "Stay low," she rasped. "You're braver than all of us." Outside, the valley rang with gunfire. Settlers fought like cornered wolves, every man and woman holding the line, not because they believed they'd win, but because they refused to kneel. Caleb stumbled through the barn doors, blood soaking his sleeve. He caught sight of Kane, calm as ever, striding through the smoke with his revolver drawn. "You think you can protect her forever?" Kane sneered, raising the barrel. "She's worth more dead than alive." Caleb's voice was a snarl through cracked lips. "You think you can take what's mine?" But Kane fired first. The shot slammed into Caleb's side, knocking him to his knees. Kane moved to finish it, but the cabin door swung wide behind him. Lena stood there, hair tangled, cheek bruised, bow in one hand, the revolver in the other. She stepped over the splintered frame, boots crunching glass and ash. Kane turned, revolver half raised. You should have run, he spat. She breathed in the smoke, the fear, the life that was finally hers to hold. I did, she whispered, but not anymore. The gunshot echoed through Raven Hollow like thunder. Kane crumpled, disbelief frozen on his face as his grip loosened. Caleb crawled to Lena's feet, blood seeping between his fingers. She dropped the revolver, pressed her hands over his wound, eyes fierce through her tears. You came back, he rasped. She bent her forehead to his. I said I would. Around them, the settlers began to emerge from the smoke and ruin, battered but standing. Little Samuel peeked out from the cabin doorway, clutching the iron pot like a warrior's shield. And for the first time in years, the bounty hunter, who had built fences against the world, looked up at a dawn worth fighting for. In the hush after the gunfire, the hunted stood unbowed. The shadows of the past gave way to something new, the fragile, unstoppable pulse of hope. When the smoke finally cleared from Raven Hollow, Caleb Hawthorne stood on the cabin porch with a blood-stained bandage under his coat and a hammer in his good hand. The fence line still bore the scars of gunfire. The barn door swung crooked on its hinges. But for the first time in years, he did not feel like a ghost haunting broken wood and cold dirt. He carved the sign himself, Hawthorne Refuge. He nailed it to the gatepost where travelers could see it as they crested the hill. No sermons, no promises carved in stone, just a word that meant something here, in this valley where the law had once turned its back. Safe. Word spread along the river trails and pine ridges. First came the lost boys, skinny shadows who'd fled forced conscription for a war they didn't believe in. Caleb let them sleep in the hayloft and taught them how to mend fences and mind the horses. Then came a widow named Ruthie, her cheeks still purple from the man she'd left behind. She found a place by the hearth that used to feel too big for one man's grief. Lena Redbird moved through it all like a pulse of warmth, her braids swinging against her back, beads clicking as she worked. She took the old South barn, once a place to birth calves and store feed, and turned it into a one-room schoolhouse. The benches were rough pine slabs, the blackboard a salvage door painted with leftover coal tar. But the children didn't mind. Comanche, settler, half-blood. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the drafty barn, eyes wide when Lena told them stories older than the hills that held their homes. She taught them the stars first, the hunter, the winter hawk, the singing woman. At night, she'd gather them under the cottonwood and point up at the cold, scattered light. Same sky, she'd say, her voice low but steady. Different stories, both true. When the lessons were done, she'd stand with Caleb by the porch rail, watching lanterns flicker to life in the bunkhouse windows, in the barn, along the trail where new families pitched tents until they could build walls of their own. One evening, Caleb turned to her, his rough fingers brushing the beads woven into her hair. You saved this place, he murmured, the words scratching out of him like roots breaking through frozen earth. Lena only shook her head. We did this, she said. No more running. They fell quiet together, listening to the wind in the pines. The same wind that had once carried the sound of grief and gunfire, now softened by laughter drifting up from the cook-fire ring. He thought of all the walls he'd built to keep the world out, and how in the end it wasn't the timber that saved him, but the people who stepped inside anyway. In a land that had taught him to fear everything he couldn't control, Caleb Hawthorne finally understood what it meant to live, standing beside those you once feared and calling them home. And so, under the wide sky of Raven Hollow, a bounty hunter's battered cabin became a refuge not just for the lost, but for hope itself. Maybe you see a bit of yourself in Caleb Hawthorne, someone who spent too many years building fences, thinking that was the only way to feel safe. Or maybe you know what it's like to be like Lena Redbird, running for so long you forget what it feels like to stand your ground. This story reminds us that sometimes the strongest barriers aren't made of boards and nails, but of neighbors who stand beside you when the world comes hunting. It's a lesson we can carry into our modern lives. Whether you live on a quiet street, a crowded city block, or a lonely farm road. In a world that feels divided, maybe the true measure of community is who stays when the fire comes. Some say Caleb and Lena's refuge still stands somewhere in these hills. Some folks swear you can hear a woman's song carried by the wind on cold nights, or see an old cross nailed above a door that never locks. Maybe that's just legend, or maybe it's a reminder that mercy and courage can echo long after gunfire fades. What do you think? Have you ever opened your door to someone who needed it most? Or been saved by the kindness of a stranger? Tell us your stories in the comments. We read every single one. Thank you for riding with us tonight. If this tale touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how love and courage never go out of style. Until next time, may your trails be wild and your refuge warm.